to disrupt the peace and in the process violate international humanitarian law. But what Putin did not expect was the extent his belligerents would unite the free world to take action. Despite the tragic circumstances of this situation, the U.S. and our allies have an opportunity to work in concert with a reconstituted resolve not seen since the outbreak of World War II. It is time for us to disarm Putin and other countries who have the ability to wield energy as a weapon. That includes the supply chains our energy systems rely on. I applauded the President's decision on Tuesday to use the authority he has to impose a ban on imports of Russian oil, petroleum, products, LNG, and coal. There was broad support in Congress to take that step across various pieces of legislation, earning 44 Senate co-sponsors in all. That's unheard of. The bill Senator Murkowski and I introduced had 37 co-sponsors. That was a necessary action to stop funding Putin's brutal war on the Ukrainian people. But now it's time for us to hone in on how we strategically use energy as a geopolitical tool and for our national security. We must use this moment to our advantage, to rebuild our energy systems in a way that makes us less reliant on actors attempting to subvert democracy and who to undermine or threaten our allies and our partners. This requires a three-pronged approach focused on domestic energy production, energy infrastructure, and supply chain security. This approach must include a near-term, mid-term, and long-term strategic focus, work in concert with the European approach, and operate in reality, including the existential necessity of addressing climate change. The International Energy Agency recently released a 10-point plan to cut EU dependence on Russian energy imports. This plan appears to be realistic and serious, not aspirational, and it happens to mesh well with my mantra of innovation, not elimination. We too need a realistic and reasonable plan that is responsive in the immediate term to our domestic needs and those of our allies, while being forward-thinking in the short term and the long term. The first immediate action item is to increase our domestic oil and gas production on both federal and non-federal lands. This is going to take both the administration and industry to step up to the plate, stop pointing fingers, take action, and just get it done. The administration has been pointing to 9,000 onshore drilling permits that have already been issued for federal leases that have not yet been drilled. What I'm told is that while this number is a little bit higher than normal, it's not extremely out of the ordinary, especially considering that 7,600 of the 9,000 of these permits have been extended past their initial 2-year term by the Bureau of Land Management. A leaseholder has to apply for this drilling permit months, if not more, in advance due to the review process, and there is no guarantee that conditions will be right in the market or in the ground to drill with a given permit. With the oil prices going negative in April of 2020 and the COVID pandemic, it isn't surprising that companies ask for extensions and slowed down over the last few years. However, as I said with the leasing pause, it is well past time for the pause to end, for well drillers and the administration to move forward. So yes, I'm calling on industry and the shareholders to invest and put production before profits. We need you to ramp up on these existing leases and with those existing permits, because that's the fastest thing that we can do. But industry also needs signals from the administration that they will support oil and gas development and production. That includes taking concrete steps, like working on a new 5-year plan for the Gulf of Mexico, since we know the current plan expires at the end of June. The administration's failure to act on the 5-year plan, combined with the failure to appeal the vacated lease sale, means that we're almost certainly looking at no offshore lease sales until sometime next year, to say nothing about the failure to hold onshore sales. The fact of the matter is, Gulf oil is the heaviest we produce, and our refineries are well calibrated for it. It makes no sense at all to me that the decision was made by Interior to not appeal a ruling throwing out the largest Gulf lease sale, particularly when that decision was made several days after Russia invaded Ukraine. We cannot take a short-sighted approach that pretends 2 years without lease sales will have no impact on our domestic oil and gas production, just because the brunt of production impact from the lack of leasing hasn't hit yet doesn't mean we can ignore them. We also need to make sure that the infrastructure we need to get product to market is able to get built. This means pipelines and export terminals and supporting corresponding infrastructure build-out in Europe and elsewhere. And I know some might bristle at investing in fossil fuel infrastructure as a long-term asset, but let me tell you, The Mountain Valley Pipeline could be completed in 4 to 6 months if it was finally given a green light. And I've got legislation would just do that, would do exactly what we just said. That would add 2 billion cubic feet per day into the market for domestic use, for export ahead of next winter, when we'll all need it the most. It would help get prices down, and it would help reduce emissions, allowing for utilities to continue to transition. And long term, it's a 42-inch pipe that can be sleeved and used for hydrogen in the future without building yet another pipeline. It's not locking us into fossilized version of the past. It's infrastructure that's flexible. It's a total no-brainer to me. We just need to get out of our own way and get it done. We've also need to be supporting our allies and partners, partner nations who don't have the LNG hubs, pipelines, and terminals they need to get natural gas to end users without relying on Russia. That's a real problem, as the European Union is heavily dependent on Russian energy, which accounts for 38% of its natural gas and 30% of its oil consumption. We need to keep that back of mind as we look ahead to, and more importantly, start planning for next winter. But this problem is not limited to natural gas or oil. In fact, while we're properly focused on Russia, we also need to be thinking about our long game. We also rely on Russia for a significant portion of our nuclear fuels and some of our minerals, notably titanium and palladium, and our reliance on critical minerals and materials produced in China and other nations hampers broader energy security and climate goals. These minerals are subject to price volatility, just like oil and gas. Just a few days ago, nickel, which is used in many energy applications, including batteries, skyrocketed, if you can believe this, skyrocketed to over $100,000 a metric ton. $100,000 a metric ton. And lithium prices are also up. In fact, right now, a nickel in your pocket is worth more than a dime based on the metals that's included in it. A nickel's worth more than a dime with the minerals that are in it. And the mining and refining of these minerals, don't start melting your nickels down. That's all, not yet. And the mining and refining of these minerals is extremely geographically concentrated, much more than oil and gas. I've heard calls for EVs as an answer for how we're going to pivot away from oil. I feel very strongly that it would be a major mistake to allow us to end up the same situation where those minerals are weaponized against us, not just for our clean energy technologies, but also for our satellites, cell phones, and more. That's in part why I've been such a big advocate for hydrogen, which we can produce right here at home with CCUS, nuclear or renewables. I want to see State and Department of Energy work together to establish bilateral, multilateral agreements and reliable countries that produce critical minerals. Additionally, the Department of Interior needs to prioritize the USGS's critical minerals effort while making sure that the department's role in permitting new mining helps facilitate that process rather than throwing up more roadblocks. Now, let me close by making it clear that I'm not saying to hell with our climate goals. These actions are not all mutually exclusive. I am a firm believer in all of the above energy mix and that we can and should be leading the world through innovation. We need to get the robust funding out of the door, and we included in the Energy Act and Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill for research, development, and commercialization in the areas of CCUS, advanced nuclear, hydrogen, transmission, renewables, storage, advanced materials, and other energy technologies to meet our emission goals. We must also increase the manufacturing of energy products, including wind turbines, batteries, solar panels, nuclear materials, technology, pipelines, and dual capability of natural gas and hydrogen, advanced materials, and anything else that will help us and our allies. That is a longer-term plan, and the one that Congress has clearly supported through these two historic pieces of legislation. And as the energy transition continues, we must be eyes wide open and responsive to solving the problems before us today, while working towards the vision we have for our future and doing our best to solve these problems before they are used as weapons against us or our allies. Finally, as we boost production here, which we must do, I want the United States to lead in deploying the technology that makes sure that our producers have the cleanest gas and barrels of oil possible. So I appreciate our witnesses for being here today to talk about these critically important issues, and look forward to this discussion about an active American energy strategy that enables us to better hone our energy as a tool. It's certainly going to take all of us, Congress, the administration, and our industry partners, to respond today and to plan for our future. With that, I'm going to turn to Senator Brasso for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your strong opening statement. Thank you for holding today's hearing, because last year President Biden inherited an energy-dominant America. He spent the last 13 months squandering it. Since day one, the President has sought to end American oil, natural gas, and coal production, and that's the source of nearly 80% of our energy. He's banned new federal leases on oil for oil and gas. He's ground to a halt the permitting of natural gas pipelines and storage facilities, and he's made it much more difficult for energy producers to obtain financing. The results have been predictable. Sky-high energy prices, the highest inflation in 40 years, new numbers out today, highest in 40 years. And of course, he has emboldened our adversaries. The price of a barrel of crude oil recently reached $129. The last time oil prices broke 100 was in 2014, and at the time, Joe Biden was Vice President of the United States. The geopolitical importance of U.S. energy dominance cannot be overstated. 2018, the United States was able to sanction Iranian oil over the country's ties to terrorism. Since we were energy dominant, those sanctions didn't increase the price for Americans at the pump. Now, the President wants to cut a deal with Iran. Boy, how times have changed. We shouldn't be bankrolling Iran's war machine, just as we shouldn't have been banking Russia's war machine. You know, we've all heard about the atrocities that Putin's troops are committing. Where do you think this barbarism has been paid for? It's been paid for by Russian energy. Energy is the single largest source of revenue to the Russian state. 2021, Russia was our third largest foreign supplier of oil after Canada and Mexico, and as Senator Murkowski has said in this hearing, that at a point that Russia was providing more oil to the United States than was Alaska. Last year, we imported nearly 700,000 barrels of Russian oil each and every day. Russia is also among the largest suppliers of uranium to the United States, as the chairman has mentioned in his opening remark. Make no mistake, the money spent on Russian energy helps support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A State Department official in the Foreign Relations Committee even said that the sales of Russian energy was the cash cow that is paid for Putin's war machine. Before the invasion, President Biden was begging OPEC and Russia to produce more oil to sell to the United States. He's now followed Congress's lead and banned imports of Russian oil, natural gas, and coal. He should also ban Russian imports of uranium. Despite skyrocketing prices, the President is still hostile to American energy production. He wants to turn to Venezuela. He wants to turn to Iran. This is his pattern. The President was willing to lead Russia and to let Russia build pipelines like Nord Stream 2. But no, he won't let Americans build pipelines, not Keystone and not pipelines today for gathering lines and to allow us to produce and use American energy. The contrast is astonishing. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows just how short-sighted the President's energy policy has been. Yet the President said not a single word about increasing American energy production in his State of the Union speech. He said, make this in America, make that in America, make the next thing in America, but not American energy, not a single word. The idea that America should be producing more energy doesn't appear to have crossed this President's mind. Rising energy costs are punishing American families, especially those on low and fixed incomes. President Biden wants us to believe that his policies are not to blame. And his solution continues to be to stop using fossil fuels. He wants to force Americans to drive expensive electric cars and insulate their homes. This is a fantasy in his mind and in that of some of the members of his administration. The reality is this world still largely runs on oil, natural gas, and coal, and that is not going to change in the foreseeable future, no matter how the work goes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Killing American oil, natural gas, and coal production isn't going to change that. It will just enrich our adversaries and leave America weaker and more insecure. The President announced that he's releasing another couple days' worth of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Others want a gasoline tax holiday. We don't need gimmicks. We need more American energy. No other major energy-producing country shuts off its own reserves to production. Not Russia, not Iran, not China, not Saudi Arabia. Why should we? Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you called attention to this talking line of the administration about the 900 leases.
9,000.
Oh, I'm sorry, 9,000 leases. As you know, the leasing is just the first area where you get permission from the government, and you pay for the lease. But then you have to apply for permission to drill. It's like you paid the rent for the apartment, but the government won't give you the key to get in the door because they haven't given you the permission yet to drill. And then, of course, once you are able to produce energy from there, they won't allow the production. They won't give you the permission to drill, to put together the pipeline to move the oil or the natural gas, specifically from where it's coming out of the ground. Look, America is a world's energy superpower. It's time, once again, we started to act like it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. I'd like to turn to our panel of witnesses that we have. First, we have Jonathan Elkin, Senior Research Scholar and Adjunct Professor at the Columbia School of International Public Affairs. We have Dr. Foss, Fellow in Energy at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. We have Colette Hertius. Is that close? Hertius. Senior Vice President of Shell's USA Gulf of Mexico Operations. We have Melody Kinderlin, Principal at the Energy Futures Initiative. Then we have by web as Dr. Kenneth Medlock, Director of the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. Mr. Elkin, we're going to start with you.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee. Over the past 2 weeks, the world has watched tragic events unfolding in Ukraine. We see utter brutality, a war of choice that the Russian president, in Orwellian fashion, will not even acknowledge for what it is. Energy and many other foundations of everyday life are reverberating from this war. As the chairman said, today's Russian economy runs on energy. The oil and gas industries represent roughly half of the country's export earnings. Moreover, oil and gas are a tool that Russia has used on several occasions to place political pressure on its neighbors. For example, in 2006, 2009, and again in 2014, real or threatened cutoffs were used to destabilize Ukraine's economy and politics. Ukraine was not the only country so treated. It is true that northwestern European companies purchased Russian gas for decades without major problems, but Russia's treatment of less powerful Central and Eastern European customers revealed something important: Moscow's willingness to use market power for political leverage. We should therefore assess our own and Europe's energy security with care. Though far from perfect, the energy security of the United States enjoys key strengths. For one, the U.S. oil and gas industry is strong. It leads the world in production, and growth is continuing. It would be a mistake, nonetheless, to view oil and gas as a silver bullet for energy security. East Coast gasoline consumers faced huge uncertainties last May after the cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline system. Just this week, we see news of a mid-February cyber attack on U.S. natural gas companies. We benefit from having diversified energy systems, and we should celebrate the dramatic growth of wind and solar power from the West Texas hills to the New York Bight and from the plains of Iowa to mountaintops in Appalachia. These projects, however, do emphasize the need to modernize our electric transmission grids. Nuclear power, as has been noted, also enhances our energy security, but it is under stress. Many reactors will go offline unless we institute policies that value carbon-free electrons. And we need to focus now, as the ranking member has said, on the fuels for advanced reactors that can enter service later this decade. Let me also note that we need a comprehensive approach to innovation, commercialization, and deployment of everything from direct air capture to CO2 pipelines, from hydrogen to long-duration storage, to enhance our energy security and sustain American competitiveness. Turning to Europe, in the past 2 decades, the EU created and strengthened integrated energy markets but it grew steadily more reliant on Russian natural gas supplies. Today, as a consequence, Europe confronts real vulnerability. This week, EU leaders are debating both old and new ideas: mandatory gas storage requirements, new LNG import capacity, alternative fuels, accelerated renewables development, even coal reserves, and perhaps extended lifetimes for German nuclear power plants. Europe will hope to buy additional LNG from the United States, Qatar, and elsewhere, but these purchases will only happen if European companies outbid other buyers. Europe and the United States face a number of common energy security threats, but in the interest of time, I will just mention two key issues in passing: cybersecurity and critical materials supply chains. Let me close with one last observation. The full energy impacts of Russia's war in Ukraine are not yet clear. Some therefore argue that the United States and Europe must de-emphasize climate protection and instead focus exclusively on security of energy supply. This is understandable, but short-sighted. Last week, the IPCC's impacts report found that as many as 3.6 billion people today live where they are highly vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. All across our country, we have witnessed devastating climate impacts: the loss of American lives, the destruction of American homes and businesses. We therefore need to respond to two kinds of risk simultaneously: the all too visible challenges to our energy security and the already clear damage from human-caused climate change. We do not have the luxury of worrying first about one and then about the other. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now we have Dr. Foss.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for the invitation to be here today. As you all pointed out, there is a rush to try to find solutions around all of this, and many of them are very popular, very strong emotions around those, but we have to face the realities, and that's what I really want to point to in my testimony this morning. The first one is that energy density matters. It really matters a lot. Human beings have gravitated towards higher energy dense materials, fuels, technologies for a very long time, for good reasons. When we move nuclear, fossil fuels out of the picture, it takes more to replace that. When you need more to replace the equivalent amount of energy that you're removing from the picture, that means more materials, more equipment, more infrastructure that has to get built, and more that has to be managed in terms of the energy supply chains. Nor do you fully get away from using materials like hydrocarbons, oil and gas. We still need them for backup. We need them for balancing to ensure reliability on power grids, and also because from those molecules we get both energy and materials. There is no other place where we have access to two things at once. Greater materials intensity means a potentially large call on new materials that, in accelerated scenarios, will stress supply chains, put pressure on prices, and increase geopolitical tension. So we sure got a lesson on that this week. I was a peer reviewer for the International Energy Agency's report, Mineral Requirements for Clean Energy Transitions. In my opinion, their estimate of a quadrupling of demand in minerals understates what we are looking at as we try to accelerate energy transitions, because we use these minerals for lots of things, and everyone forgets that. Base demand for non-fuel minerals has grown faster than petroleum and natural gas, almost as fast as electric power. Plastics and resins, which make up a lot of alternative energy technology equipment, have grown faster than some of the metals. Without plastics and resins, you wouldn't have wind turbine blades, you wouldn't have plexiglass for solar PV, you wouldn't have upwards of 50 to 60% of the content of the electric vehicles that everybody wants to make. So this is a real issue. We have distinct opposition to mining and minerals processing in our country. Fitch and other credit ratings agencies have taken note of this. Quality matters. Not all minerals and metals are the same. When it comes to things like electric vehicle batteries, semiconductors, and other sensitive industries, purity is a really big deal, and that puts a lot of pressure on mineral supply chains and processing and sourcing. China is all over the place in this business. We're spending an awful lot of time tracking Chinese dominance across the minerals supply chains in the countries where they are making investments. They represent about a quarter of the world's production of non-fuel minerals. Their outbound investments are all over the place: Africa, South America, East Asia, and Russia. We are very, very concerned about their control of sensitive minerals. Like rare earths, there's been a lot of conversation about that. The Chinese formed a monolithic state-owned enterprise to control their own rare earth resource, which the rest of the world depends on. They also control the bulk of electric vehicle battery manufacturing, the bulk of battery manufacturing in general, also capacity for wind turbine and solar PV equipment, and many other things that everybody needs to rely on to get all of this stuff done. One of the really big concerns I have is how we think about the math around the oil and gas part of the picture. When the industry makes investments, upstream is funded by the sale of every molecule that gets produced. When you start locking out the sales of molecules, you impact the revenue that's available to the industry to do all the things that everybody would like it to do, including diversity in its capital investments. And that's a really important point. One of the issues is going to be how to reduce supply, if that's what we want to do, and maintain the amount of hydrocarbon-based materials that our lives depend on so dramatically. Energy demand is increasing in a lot of interesting ways, which the chairman pointed out to. In all of this, thinking about how we should go forward and all the risks that we face, scaling up these businesses, building the ecosystem for alternative energy technologies and diversification. Some recommendations from me, would be to not push fossil fuels out of the mix at such a fast pace. We would do that at our peril. You would be exposing consumers and voters to risks that are unnecessary at this time. The industry needs access to locations. It needs capital for investment. It needs services to support those investments. We need creative thinking about managing emissions. We have ideas about that at Rice University that I hope my colleague Ken Medlock touches on, related to hydrogen production and carbon sequestration. And we need to put materials first in your thinking. Please do that. Without putting materials first, every other thing that gets discussed becomes less stable, less promising, less uncertain. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hersius.
Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My work as Senior Vice President for Shell's Gulf of Mexico operations fits within a global marketplace affected by the invasion of Ukraine. We are disturbed, and I'm personally heartbroken by this unprovoked attack, which threatens global security and stability. In response, Shell has announced its exit from Russian joint ventures and withdrawal from all Russian hydrocarbons. Although right, it is not easy. It carries serious consequences. Europe relies on exports from Russia to heat homes, drive cars, and aid the defense of Ukraine. This crisis powerfully highlights the need to move away from fossil fuels. Shell is committed to provide more and cleaner energy solutions and to help the world transition to a net zero system by 2050. Our dilemma now is how to restore the energy security while making the transition. We can and must do both. Today's hearing is about how quickly we can resolve supply constraints, bring more natural gas to Europe, and produce enough energy to ease prices at home. Gulf of Mexico production has amongst the lowest greenhouse gas intensity in the world. For years, Shell has been working as fast as we can to bring that production online. For example, a new field will begin producing in the next few weeks. It's worth noting that Shell's carbon environmental footprint continues to shrink as we use existing infrastructure and innovation to produce energy more efficiently. Regarding this dilemma of energy security and transition, we offer 3 thoughts. Number 1, diversify energy supply with lower carbon sources. 2, immediate government action to bring supply online sooner. And 3, a comprehensive medium to long-term energy policy. First, diversifying energy supply and increasing lower carbon sources is essential. Shell is making substantial investments in American renewables, like our recent $380 million investment for New York wind leases. We have made new investments in solar, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, and CCUS projects. Second, both federal and state governments can take specific actions to address the ongoing crisis, including release of strategic petroleum reserves along with international partners to provide some near-term relief, address a backlog of LNG export permits so the United States can supply allies, especially those in Europe, and move forward with permitting oil and gas infrastructure and projects that could come online within weeks or months. From my perspective, these permits are needed to bring additional volumes online in the Gulf of Mexico, which remains key to our shared objectives of stabilizing supply and accelerating the transition to net zero. Third, America needs a comprehensive, long-term energy policy that includes the thoughtful production of lower carbon intensity oil and gas as a responsible element of the transition. The Interior Department should address the fact that no federal oil and gas leases have been issued in over a year, and urgently work to restart federal leasing. Shell's position is clear. Climate change is real. Energy security is fragile. World demand continues to rise. We must find a way to meet the urgent supply needs while reducing carbon intensity of our energy system. This is an inflection point. How we balance security of supply and transition in this crisis will determine our nation's energy future. Let us rise to this moment and use unparalleled resources of our hardworking American people and their American ingenuity, not simply to meet the current supply crisis, but to build a more diverse, lower carbon energy system while we do so. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you. Mrs. Kinderdine.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Barrasso, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. First, let me extend my support for the Ukrainian people. Their strength and resolve in the face of Russia's brutality is inspirational. This crisis and the global response crystallizes critical energy security imperatives. The immediate focus on the need for gas and oil supplies underscores their current importance for the health, safety, security, and economies of the U.S. and its allies. At the same time, we cannot lose focus on the need for deep decarbonization by mid-century. The crisis and the world's response underscore the need for a thoughtful, informed, and sequenced strategy for the transition from fossil fuels to a deeply decarbonized future. In 2014, we received an early warning signal about the current Russian designs on Ukraine when in February of that year it invaded, then annexed Crimea. The response of the U.S. allies was swift. The G8 became the G7. We kicked Russia out. DOE put together a set of modernized energy security principles, not oil-centric, that had been to that point. Those were adopted by the G7 leaders. The principles focused in part on flexible gas markets and emissions reductions, not surprisingly. The leaders also recommended an immediate focus on promoting low-carbon technologies, renewables, nuclear, and CCS, and promoting a more integrated liquefied natural gas market around the world. My remarks will focus on two of these, global LNG trade and the metals and minerals needed for low-carbon technologies. Replacing Russian gas in Europe via supply source diversification will be difficult in the near to midterm. Many countries in Europe are 93 to 100% dependent on Russian gas. Fortunately, the U.S. is in a strong position to provide major assistance in the LNG space. The U.S. is now the #1 natural gas producer in the world and the world's largest exporter of LNG. Clearly, we need to do all we can to supply our allies in Europe, but we also have allies in Asia. Our largest consumers of U.S. LNG are Japan and South Korea. So satisfy the Europeans now. We've got other allies we need to worry about as well. It's also clear that in the near to midterm, more supply and additional export capacity is needed. Existing global LNG import regasification facilities, total, including those under construction, totaled 1,102 million tons per year. 64% of that demand is in Asia. On the flip side, our LNG export capacity existing and under construction is 576 million tons per year. The difference between demand and supply is 525 million tons per year. So importantly, we don't want Russia to fill that gap, and it's surely looking for other markets for its natural gas right now. Fortunately, we have planned supply in the U.S. of another, and the world, 571 million tons per year. 48% of that is in the United States. We need to expedite decisions on that planned capacity and fill that gap and make sure that the Russians don't. We also can't lose sight of the fact that the LNG production and consumption will increase greenhouse gas emissions depending on what it's replacing. The industry needs to dramatically reduce its methane emissions. Just do it. We have the technologies. Do it. Others have mentioned carbon capture and hydrogen, and so I'll leave it at that. They're important. Now a few words on energy security issues raised by the growing need for metals and minerals for the clean energy transition. In 2017, the UN's Environment Program concluded that low-carbon technologies will need over 600 million metric tons more metal resources in a 2-degree than a 6-degree scenario. The U.S. is, I looked at the critical, USGS has categorized 50 metals and minerals as critical. The U.S. is 50% import on 27, import dependent on 27 of those, 100% import dependent on 13 of them. And we get a lot of them from China, so we need to be very careful. We need to engage our allies and trading partners through all available forums to protect those supply chains. They are new supply chains, and we need recycling. IEA says that we can get 9% of the materials we need for batteries by 2040 via recycling. Let me just say, in closing, raise a couple of suggestions. We have a LEED standard for buildings. I think we need a LEED standard for mines. I would call it a leadership in equitable and environmentally responsible mining. Such a certification could provide a carrot, not a stick, and provide a key differentiator for mining businesses. And so I think that that's something we should do. This raises an important issue about the energy transition as well, creating additional and critical jobs focused on rural America. Auto repair is currently a major, if not the major, center of commerce in many small towns in rural America. EVs will diminish that commercial activity. Creating recycling centers for batteries and other key materials in rural areas could help replace that commerce. And finally, we tend to think of energy security in terms of fuels. Beyond the cost of commodities such as copper, metals and minerals are used for clean energy technology are capital costs, not fuel costs. The lifespan of all of these clean energy technologies defines the draw on the metals and minerals that we are talking about. So the lifespan of those technologies is a measure of our energy security. Manufacturing warranties aside, we need to assess and understand and get honest assessments of the lifespan of those technologies. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Medlock, via web.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, the rest of the committee. Glad to be here virtually. Wish I could be there in person, but scheduling didn't permit. The topic of this hearing is very interesting, and it's an issue that tends to rise up and bite us every so often. The issue around Russian natural gas in particular has been something that has been explored ad nauseum over the last 2 decades, and there have been many recommendations made by various parties with regard to Europe's dependence on Russian gas and what it could actually bring forth, yet they've largely been ignored. In fact, if you think about Russian dependence on natural gas, and I think Jonathan referred to this earlier, but in 2012, it was roughly 26% of market share in Europe. Today, it's about 38%. So despite the obvious warning signs, dependence has actually grown, not declined. And that raises a really interesting point about just the concept of energy security that I just want to refer to. It's important first to recognize that the definition of energy security has changed over the last 3 decades. It's broadened substantially to incorporate environmental concerns, social concerns, et cetera, and all of those definitely matter. As an economist, what I tend to focus on and what the economics literature generally tends to focus on in talking about energy security are the macroeconomic implications of unexpected shocks to supply or increases in price. And typically what we see historically is a massive amount of macroeconomic malaise that ensues as a result of these unexpected outages or unexpected price shocks. And then we tend to think about what sorts of hedging tools can we deploy to minimize those shocks in the future. And there have been tremendous strides taken by policymakers if we go back over 50 years now in this dimension. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a great example of something that was created in an effort to mitigate the negative impacts associated with unexpected outages. And certainly that's one that should be on the table in the short term right now, given what's transpiring in global energy markets and how it's impacting U.S. consumers at the pump currently. But one thing that is really important to recognize is energy security in particular has shifted dramatically since 2000, just over the last 20 years. And that's largely the result of the shale revolution, as it's often referred to. The shale revolution is one of the single largest drivers of transitions in global energy systems that we've seen in a long time. It has dramatically shifted geopolitical discourse. It's changed lines of trade. It's changed investment patterns. Of course, demand growth in Asia over the last 20 years has been equally dramatic in terms of its implications for the global energy system. But without a doubt, shale has transitioned the U.S. from a position of becoming more energy import dependent to becoming less. In fact, back in 2011, 2012 timeframe, the U.S. State Department had on the Bureau of Energy Resources website declared the U.S. to be an energy superpower. And I can tell you, we see that as well. We actually host pre-COVID, and it's starting to pick up again now, thankfully, an average of 23 different delegations from different countries around the world every year. And in every case, when those individuals would walk through the door, they wanted to talk about U.S. energy. Understand what was happening in the shale patch, understand how policy was influencing the ability to access those resources through trade. So a lot of interest. The world watches what we do, without a doubt. Now, I want to point something out about shale because this is really important. I think it rings with a lot of remarks that have been made so far today. What drove shale? It was a combination of legal structures, of regulatory architecture, of property rights, but at the core of it, it's innovation. And if we want to think about how the world of energy is going to transform over the next 30 years, innovation is going to be critical. So as we think about the future and we think about the geopolitical prowess that shale has brought to the front of the stage, in particular, it is a blunt force tool that we can use to hedge against Russian hegemonic intent. I've got some colleagues that have written about this with regard to the situation in Lithuania, where once that terminal was actually under construction, the Russians renegotiated gas price terms with Lithuania because they realized that the potential to bring in LNG largely from the U.S. was a credible threat to their ability to use gas as a weapon. So, things like that are incredibly important to internalize, but at the core of it is innovation. And I said to this committee, I think 3 years ago, that we've got to have a long view when we talk about innovation, because the next great innovation is in the mind of a 4-year-old somewhere playing with Legos. We don't know what it is, but we have to create platforms that encourage it so that it can actually begin to make meaningful transitions that are commercially viable and don't really require tremendous government support to move forward, because Quite frankly, when those innovations materialize, they are game-changing, and they actually have tremendous implications for our ability in the United States to impact outcomes everywhere. So tremendous foreign policy tool. Thank you very much.
Let me say thank you to all of you. It was extremely important for us to hear from the expertise you all have and also your opinions on this. We're at a critical time right now. We're going to start with our questions. I'll start, and then we'll go around. We're at a critical junction, I believe, in as far as in the world and our country, what role we play in the world. We're looked to be as a leader. I think there's some of my friends and colleagues that believe that we're going to throw caution to the wind and just double down on fossil and forget about the cleaner environment that we're responsible for and how we do it with technology. That's the furthest thing from the truth. I think we can do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we have to. We're at a critical stance right now, how quickly we can get back into production and get up to where we can not only defend ourselves and keep ourselves independent, but how we can help our allies, which are going to need it. We have no idea how this thing might end. No one ever thought that we'd be in a situation we are now, and Ukraine would be faced with an unbelievable war going on now. Atrocities are happening to innocent people. And I don't think the world will stand for that, but it could go further than this, without very much provoking. So what I would ask all of you, the only thing I know that we can get back in, and quick, we talked about leasings not being done, pipelines not being built, this and that. Can you give me your opinion on the Defense Production Act? Is this a time for us to consider the Defense Production Act to get things done so we get ourselves back in the strength of being energy independent, but also being relied upon to help our allies so they don't have to go back, even though they don't want to, be going back to Russia or areas of the world where basically we have very little influence, and basically it's to our detriment for them to be able to supply the energy. I mean, we're hearing all the criticism, talking to Iran, talking to Venezuela. The Saudis are sitting on the sidelines doing nothing right now because of the strained relationships we have with them. All of this. But the only way that we can do something is to get back into the game. So I'll just go down quickly if you can give me your opinions on that. And Dr. Foss, I'll start with you because it looks like you're ready.
I'm not a DPA lawyer. I would like to consult one on your question.
What's the quickest way to get back in? And how do you think it's important? Do all of you think it's important for us to
What I was going
quickly?
to say is that one of the interesting DPA procurements is the minerals procurement in partnership with Australia.
Okay.
To the extent that we need to rely on international sources, we do have friends out there. And if DPA can be used to, with procurement to help move things along, it's not going to solve the problem tomorrow, but it gets things in the works that will make a difference 10 years down the road. In an important way. So you could think about that.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. Mr. Elkin.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman. I, too, am not a DPA expert, so I can't comment.
I think what I'm asking about the urgency. That's the only thing I know that we can use to have the urgency that we need the products.
Look, the even more urgent feature that we need to really be aware of is the cyber threat to the energy systems. We are seeing it all the time in the press in the United States. Europe, likewise, has got to be in the crosshairs of those that would like to complicate their energy security and their ongoing economic operations. This is a hard area because of the sensitivity and the intelligence that is underlying most of the actions. But intensifying collaborations there, it seems to me, would be an important and really near-term step.
Ms. Gracious.
Yes, Chairman, I think the answer is yes. There's clear urgency, and we need to move quickly on many fronts. I think there are tools that are in our hands today. We can increase production. We can increase infrastructure, which will really help with the flexibility that we need.
Under normal conditions right now, so you're in the private sector, what would it take you to get up and running right now, just as things have happened in the past, the permitting process, getting things ramped up and everything? We're in unusual times right now, so tell me what normal.
So in my sector, in the Gulf of Mexico, seismic permits is something that we need to get after to make sure that we can continue to drill wells. And also, in the longer term, we need to make sure that we have the stock of leases that are coming in so we can continue to sustain the supply.
Thank you. Ms. Kinderdine?
As I mentioned, there are a lot of LNG projects in development. Whatever we can do to expedite those projects and get them done. I've checked into the availability of LNG tankers. There are tankers available. I'm going to be the third person who said I'm not an expert on the Defense Production Act, but I have a little bit of concern about declaring emergencies. I know we had to do that to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We're drawing that down. We could do an SPR exchange right now without declaring an emergency, and I think the market is pretty backwardated. I've been looking into that as well. So get oil onto the market in addition to getting gas onto the market. I think there are a lot of things that we could do, but expediting those projects that are under development, not the ones, and the ones that are under construction, but expediting those projects.
Thank you. And Dr. Medlock, you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think urgency is critical, and I think it's critical that we work hand in hand with our allies in Europe. And something that had been mentioned yet, but the use of floating storage and regasification units, so FSRU units for LNG, should be on the table. You can actually view those as short-term fixes to advance more supply of natural gas into Europe, which needs it dramatically right now. So longer term, though, yeah, anything that can be done to accelerate or expedite permitting and production would pay massive benefits.
Yeah. Well, the only reason I'm saying, I'll wrap up real quick here. The only reason I'm saying that is because sitting in different committees, we've been in different, at the SCIF, hearing different proposals, what's going on. This is a critical time for us. We don't know where it's gone, but we have a full-fledged war going on in Ukraine with Russia with no end in sight until they conquer. Where do they stop? What's the end game? We don't know. The bottom line, what we do know is that Russia has weaponized energy, and they have used it as a geopolitical weapon. And the only thing I know about an adversary or a bully is if they have a weapon, you better have one that'll match it or better than theirs. And we do. We just haven't used it. How quickly we get it in production is going to be whether we are able to thwart this or not, and that's the concerns I have. With that, I'm going to turn to Senator Barrasso for his question.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I think you're absolutely right. And you talked about Russia. You know, Ms. Hertzdias, over the years, Shell, an international company, has made significant investments in Russian oil and natural gas production. The company is also part of a joint venture which built Nord Stream 2. Last Friday, Shell purchased 100,000 metric tons of Russian crude oil at a massive discount. Shell has since apologized for the purchase and has announced that it will stop buying Russian oil. This is the right decision. I understand Shell now also intends to exit its joint ventures with Gazprom, including Nord Stream 2. Could you just give us an update in terms of the status and progress of Shell's efforts to divest these assets?
Yes, thank you, Senator Barrasso. And indeed, we did purchase a tanker of Russian crude, and since then announcements have been made. Our CEO has made it very clear that we apologize for that and are taking all steps to withdraw from our joint ventures. That includes upstream. It also includes our lubricants business in country. It includes our downstream gas stations, and also extends to all purchases outside of country of any hydrocarbon products.
And when should we expect the divestments to be complete?
As far as a date, I'm happy to provide an update to you or to the committee. You know, you can imagine it's a pretty detailed and process that needs to be executed and make sure that we can do that safely. The withdrawal is clear, and it'll be expedited.
Thank you. Dr. Foss, the administration is claiming that rising gas prices are all the fault of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But gasoline prices have been rising well before that invasion. The president doesn't want to take any responsibility. Instead, he claims it is simply not true that my administration or policies are holding back domestic energy production. So here's a chart here. I want to get that into the shot with the camera if we could. We want to make sure that the witnesses can see it as well. So looking at the average weekly prices for from the point of Biden's inauguration, which was here, at the time, we talked about $2.48 a gallon. Biden's inflation accounts for about $1.14 of that. Putin's invasion of Ukraine adds 58 cents to that. So has the Biden administration's energy policy affected current and future oil and gas production here in the United States?
We've already talked about leasing. Colette did a really wonderful job on that. Let's talk about how perception is reality. This is my really, really, really big concern. And when you're deep in the oil and gas patch, this is what you hear about the most. You don't take a lease, you can't execute on the lease unless you have capital available to you. There are threats against capital for the industry that are just simply not constructive. It's not necessary. It's really silly in many respects. The idea is to starve the industry of capital, to keep it from operating, to force us off of oil and gas before we can viably move forward with other things. Investors see that. Financial markets see that. Regulators see that. A lot of this is coming from nominees who are being proposed for key regulatory positions in financial markets. That gets out there. It creates uncertainty. Companies can deal with risk. You can quantify risk. Uncertainty is open-ended. That's very tough to deal with. Whether your government is with you or against you, that's a big amount of uncertainty that affects decisions. What am I going to invest in? What kind of project and when, over what time frame, and other things. So those are my biggest concerns. It's the things that are in the background that are contributing to gasoline prices today, because this is going on for a while. For over a year, we have been seeing these pressures build in financial markets. We've been hearing this discussion. It's been coming at the industry from all directions, and that takes its toll eventually, and you have to add that into the mix.
Can I get to one other thing that you talked about in your testimony? So there are 260 million cars and light-duty trucks in the United States today. If you wanted to move to all-electric vehicles in America tomorrow, do we produce enough critical minerals? You know, where are we going to get the minerals from? Could we do it without relying on minerals from Russia, China, Chinese-controlled mines? I mean, the Secretary of Transportation the other day said, well, put everybody in electric vehicles. Can you kind of run down the possibility of doing that, what it would take, how many years, and what it's going to cost to get those minerals?
We couldn't do it ourselves. There's no way we can do it ourselves. The U.S. is currently about 12% of total non-fuel minerals tonnage, and a lot of that is aggregate for construction. We don't produce enough to support what companies are trying to build out now in terms of battery manufacturing capacity, or for that matter, semiconductors fabs in manufacturing to support all of the other things that are needed. I mentioned Chinese dominance. I've talked about this in House Energy and Commerce testimony and other hearings. The mining industry is as much under pressure as other basic industries are to make investments and to be able to find opportunities to execute on, to be able to bring those into the market. And it doesn't help when you have an uncertain political context in your own market. So this is really an issue. There are best practices for the mining industry out there, by the way. The mining industry responds to what comes out of the World Bank, to the ICMM, which provides cross-cutting standards for companies for ESG and best practices in mining operations. So it's not like the industry is not responsible or not looking at how to be responsible going into the future. But it's the same problem. You have to have access to the minerals. You have to have the capital to develop the minerals. You have to have the supply chains to support them. One last point about this. Everything that we're planning in the United States, the announcements, the joint ventures, invariably include partners that have supply chains that they can bring into our country. That means international sourcing. So we're going to continue to rely on metals and materials that are produced outside of the United States, because that's the fastest way for the industry to try to accelerate, given all the time frames that are under discussion.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's talk facts, because what I hear coming from some of my colleagues are more of the politics than the true facts. So crude oil and natural gas prices are primarily determined by global markets and international events, which is why American families are hurting right now in Nevada and across the country under these high energy prices. I'm hearing this conversation about threats against capital in the industry, but here's a fact. Oil and gas companies certainly are not hurting. The 6 largest publicly traded oil and gas companies, including Shell, reported combined profits of $90 billion for 2021. And on top of that, the oil and gas industry already receives an estimated $3.1 billion in taxpayer subsidies each year. In recent days, major oil companies in the United States have said that they would rather use their earnings from higher prices to boost payouts to shareholders and expand their operations slowly rather than rush to drill new or develop existing wells. So, Ms. Hirsch, my question to you is, can you explain, at a time like this, why your company would be prioritizing payouts to shareholders rather than working to increase our oil supply?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Thanks for the question. At this time, I think it's important that we continue to proceed to increase all of the energy sources that we have. And that includes looking at what are the levers that we have to make sure that we can add additional electrons into the system. Because when we add electrons, we displace...
Thank you. I only have so much time. But my question is this, directly. Why are you prioritizing your payouts to your shareholders instead of working to increase the oil supply? Let me ask you this. Would your company be willing to forego paying out dividends to pass along that relief to consumers who are seeing high prices in my state and across the country?
Yeah, so the prices are something that we do not control. I think that you said that yourself. The way in which we prioritize...
So you would not be willing to pass off your dividends to consumers who are hurting right now?
We are committed to continue to invest and make sure that our production does not decline.
All right, I've only got so much time, so let me move on here because I didn't get an answer to my question. Let me just say this. It is false to lay blame on the Biden administration's energy policies as the cost and the cause for the high gas prices that currently facing Americans right now. And I see some heads nodding here. That's absolutely right. In fact, the data that I have, and please tell me if this is incorrect, the BLM under the Biden administration has approved more permits to drill last year than it did in the first 3 years of the Trump administration. And oil production on federal public lands is higher now than at any point since at least 2003. We have heard this statistic. The oil and gas industry has more than 9,100 approved permits to drill that have not yet been put into use, and 14 million acres of leased public lands that have not been put into production. And I keep hearing, well, we got to increase production, but there is the opportunity to already do that. So, Mr. Elkin, can you explain to me why are oil and gas permits going unused if they could help lower costs? And then could you also distinguish between federal and public lands? My understanding is 90% of oil production in the U.S. takes place on private and state-owned land, and we're only talking about 10% on federal land. So can you answer those questions for me, if that's true? And if it's not, please clarify for me.
Senator, I do not have a different understanding of the current ratio of federal to non-federal lands. But I think it is really important that we take a look at two things here. One is the financial discipline, has come from Wall Street, from investors that are putting capital into these companies. John Hess, the chairman of Hess Petroleum, was quoted as saying earlier this week at CERAWeek, investors have been telling oil companies not to invest so much. Well, this is a crisis. We should be investing more as an industry. We've had 5 years of underinvestment, and we're paying for it now. I do stress the 5 years.
And explain that. Put that in public. 5 years of underinvestment in what? In new drills, in new sites, right?
New upstream drilling, yes.
That's right. So the oil companies have been listening to Wall Street, right, and not actually investing in new drilling sites.
The investors keep them alive. So from that perspective, that is understandable. I also think it's important to note that the price increases that one has seen in the last year also reflect the massive upswing in economic activity as we recover after COVID. So this is a really important thing to keep in mind as a backdrop to retail prices.
So let me ask you, and this is my final question, because this is why this is just driving, I think it's just a false narrative that somehow this administration is responsible. You just said for the last 5 years. they have been underinvesting. And so is it true investment in new wells has dropped more than 60%? That's nearly 25% just as the COVID virus hit. And so now they're trying to play catch up. Is that correct?
Look, it is only natural.
Based on the demand.
It's only natural that oil companies reduced their production when demand cratered, and demand did crater. So I think as an economic matter, that only makes sense. It's pretty tough for American consumers now to be looking at the prices that we're seeing today. That's really hard stuff. But the fact that the production went down when it did in 2020 should not surprise us.
Right, and that was prior to this current administration, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hurstius, do you believe the Biden administration has been withholding lease sales specifically to raise costs for consumers? Before you answer that, I want to explain a little further what I'm getting at. In the Cook Inlet sale, the administration, in issuing its draft EIS in October of last year, stated that by withholding leases, this is on pages 46 and 47 of the draft EIS, as I recall it, if they were to proceed with not doing this, that the result would be a decrease in demand and resulting in lower emissions, because as the price of oil and oil-related products, including gasoline, increased, people would diminish consumption. Now, I also want to add here that prices of gasoline are up considerably, and so too is consumption up. So, twofold question. You think the Biden administration has been withholding lease sales in order to raise energy costs, perhaps with an environmental objective in mind? And do you believe that doing that produces environmental benefits?
So with regard to lease sales, and has it raised the cost to consumers? I do not think that not having lease sales has raised the cost to consumers. I think that Mr. Elkin described very well some of the elements that have heavily contributed to the prices that we see today.
And do you think that part's deliberate in order to discourage and diminish consumption and therefore emissions?
I mean, I think that the leases that we need to retain and bring into the system, there's a bit of a misconception about it. These leases, this idea of an idle lease doesn't really exist. There's an evaluation period that is required after we bid on the lease, and there really is no benefit to holding on to a lease. So once we bring it into to our portfolio, so given in Shell's portfolio, we begin an evaluation process. We submit permits that will allow us to conduct activities on those leases. And then if we like what we see, and really about 10% of the remaining leases in the Gulf of Mexico, we estimate to have oil and gas. So in many cases, we acquire a lease, we do technical work, and then we determine that we don't want to drill on those leases. In some cases, we decide we do want to drill on those leases, and when we do, we are either successful or unsuccessful. And if we're unsuccessful, we relinquish that lease and put it back into circulation. If we're successful, then it takes additional time, and while no activity is going on physically on the lease, there's a large amount of evaluation and interpretation that's required to determine how best to develop those natural resources.
So not every lease results in a drilled well. Not every drilled well ends up being a smashing success.
That's correct.
And so as a result of that, there's a connection. You have to have a flow of approved leases in order to keep it moving. Is that right?
That's correct.
Without that, you shut it down. Now, it appears to me that this is a feature, not a bug, for the Biden administration. They want to keep supply low so they can bring costs higher. This business of saying, oh, we're surprised, we're upset that the prices are this high, that is a feature, not a bug, based on what they're saying. And that's deeply concerning to me, because that harms the American people. And it harms them in a way that does not improve the environment. There's still demand for that. That demand goes somewhere. It goes to other people producing oil and gas in a way that's less environmentally responsible than it is here, resulting in even more emissions as they move it across oceans or otherwise in order to get it here. And I think that's unfortunate. Now, the Biden administration recently announced a ban on Russian energy imports. We've got to keep in mind that Russian oil, while a small percentage of our overall oil consumption, does include a fair amount of heavy crude. And heavy crude is an important feedstock for many U.S. refineries. I'm worried about this because I wonder how this ban will interact. I mean, I think it was probably the right thing to do to not buy heavy crude from them, not buy products from them, especially at this moment. But we do have to know where we're going to get heavy crude from. And so I worry about the interaction of that ban with the Biden administration's still undeterred, unchanged policies discouraging domestic production. If we can't produce and distribute that critical feedstock, we'd have to turn to a number of places outside the United States that are where we'd rather not be propping up vile dictators, horrible human rights abuses, and reckless environmental practices. Places like Venezuela, Iraq, and China are among the world's leading consumers. Now, we do have some that we can produce in the United States, including the Uinta Basin. It's one of the reasons why the administration must sign the record of decision approving the Uinta Basin Railway, especially now. This has never been more important than it is right now. They need to approve that, but they haven't. They've blown past the anticipated time when they should have approved it. We've never needed that more right now. This is good oil. It's oil that is very useful, that we desperately need right now. 30% of it that would be transported on that is owned by the Ute Indian tribe. It needs to be approved. But if we can't get that done, where would we have to go? And what would we do to get the heavy crude we need to maintain our feedstock?
Yeah, so I think the decisions that have been made in the past were under a different context. And I think it's important that we look at the decisions that need to be made now in the context that we have now. It is a crisis that we're under, and the solutions to this current crisis need to be very quickly thought through, and urgent action needs to be taken now. And I think that spans the spectrum from looking at what are some of the solvable problems of permitting and approvals that can take place that allow LNG exports to begin flowing more freely, both to Europe as well as our Asian allies. It also includes looking at pipelines. It also includes making sure that we continue to progress against our energy transition objectives, which include CCUS, as well as leasing and permitting in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as onshore. And I think with all of those combined, we do have the resources and need to really stay focused on how we can move quickly to make sure that we both have energy security for the U.S. and our allies, as well as making sure that we're progressing against our energy transition objectives.
Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Ms. Herstius, I want to follow up on Senator Lee's and Senator Cortez Masto's questions here. So, like everywhere else in the country, my state, Arizona, folks are paying way too much for a gallon of gas. It's really hurting families. They're having to make some really tough decisions. I'm one who believes that we currently need an all-of-the-above strategy that includes increased domestic production of crude oil. You mentioned this is a crisis. We need urgent action now. You started to outline a couple of the, I'd say, more global options here, but I want to hear specifically from you more about your company's plans to increase production here in the United States. How much more can you increase it? When can you do it? And do you think you'll be successful?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Kelly. Yes, I think we'll be successful, but let me describe a bit of what it looks like to be successful in that growth. So our largest production comes from the Gulf of Mexico. In the Gulf of Mexico, we have a 15 to 20% average decline rate. That means if we just continue to produce from the wells and reservoirs that we have, year on year, that production will decline by 15 to 20%. And that just has to do with the dynamics of the reservoirs from which we produce. In order to maintain flat, we need to continue to drill wells and we need to continue to acquire seismic data, and we need to continue to acquire leases that allow that conveyor belt of activity to continue, right? And that will sustain our production. So this year, we'll be bringing on a new field in the next couple of weeks. That's new growth, new production that will come online very soon. We have 10 rigs that we continue to run across the Gulf of Mexico that continuously drill exploration and development wells to make sure that we are replenishing against our total production. We have a new platform, Vito, that has just sailed into the Gulf of Mexico. It's sitting on Texas shores being fitted out with the final fittings and will sail out into the Gulf of Mexico so that it can begin producing either late this year, early next year, are what our ambitions are. So there are many things that we continue to progress to make sure that we are maintaining the production and adding new production day in and day out.
A year from now, where do you think you'll be as a percentage compared to where you are today?
So percentage-wise, because we have this decline, our objective is to remain about flat. Now, the levers that we have to significantly increase production, and we were talking about oil and gas production, as Mr. Elkin described, is really the flexibility that we have onshore. We can bring production on stream from our onshore activities more quickly than we can in the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, well, please let us know what you need from us to facilitate that.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
That's greatly appreciated.
Mr. Elkin, Senator John McCain used to say, and I love this quote, Putin's Russia is a giant gas station pretending to be a real country. On Tuesday, the president signed an executive order banning imports of all Russian fossil fuels. I supported that as one of 10 members of this committee. We proposed legislation to do that, and he took those steps. Mr. Elkin, I'd like to get your thoughts on how American energy production compares to Russia's environmentally. And Senator Lee alluded to this. So, for example, the International Energy Agency reports that Russia's oil and gas production is about 30% more methane intensive than the United States. Does Russia's fossil fuel sector, which is, as I think we all know, rotten with corruption, have environmental monitoring and enforcement practices anywhere close to that of the United States?
Senator, thank you for that question. I don't think that looking at the history of the Russian oil and gas industry, the first feature you would call out would be the environmental performance of it. This, in fact, is one of the downsides of the withdrawal of the major international oil companies from their activities there, is that also what will go away is some of that environmental performance that is core to their operations. Now, having said that, in the United States, we have a big honking problem, and that's called methane emissions. Yes, I think it is a reasonable suspicion to say that Russia's methane emissions exceed those of our own, but if we want for our LNG to be purchased on global markets, as I do, we need to make sure that we are able to improve and radically reduce the methane emissions from the value chain. This is an area of huge unfinished business that needs to be attended to, sir.
All right, well, thank you. We certainly agree we need to work on that. And thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Senator Daines.
Thank you. Today's an opportunity for us to discuss something the whole world is focused on and how energy plays a pivotal role in global politics. The importance of energy security and global energy dominance cannot be overstated. It's something I've been vocal on since I first came to Congress in 2013. The United States has an abundance of energy. Vast oil, natural gas, coal, water, wind, solar, strong nuclear energy programs. This abundance should be used as a tool, not only for our own energy security, but also for supplementing and supporting our overseas partners. We do it the right way here in America. In terms of environmental stewardship, the more energy that can be produced in America the better we are overall in terms of global environmental stewardship, because we do it the right way. We have the most stringent environmental standards. This abundance should be used as a tool to drive more energy production in America, to secure our future economically and geopolitically, but instead of growing this all-of-the-above energy portfolio and diversifying and strengthening our domestic supply chains, this administration has taken action after action to weaken domestic energy and advance a very one-sided, very ideological climate agenda. This effort has weakened America's ability to respond globally and has further emboldened Putin's weaponization of energy. Now, I've heard the White House say again and again that they have done nothing to weaken American oil and gas production. That could not be further from the truth. That is a lie. Since day one in office, this administration has sent a chilling message to traditional energy production. Whether it's official actions from the administration or statements by his appointees, he's made it clear that he intends to shut down domestic oil and gas production and mining. Don't just take it from me. Here are the facts. In the Democrat primary debate on CNN, President Biden himself made it a campaign promise to stop all oil and gas production, saying, and I'm quoting the president, no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling, including offshore, no ability for the industry to continue to drill, period. Those came from President Biden. On day one, his administration, he personally killed the Keystone XL pipeline. Then he took action to halt federal oil and gas lease sales. By the way, Montana still has not had a lease sale, despite federal law and a federal judge requiring it. Then he revoked existing, already purchased leases in Alaska's 1002 area. Following all that, the Biden administration began a regulatory deluge of rules limiting domestic production. The EPA is increasing regulations on methane emissions. The administration is creating even more uncertainty for WOTUS regulations. FERC recently passed rules to make it more difficult to permit new natural gas pipelines and facilities. Then there was the tax and spend bill that the president was strongly pushing that included higher royalty rates, new methane fees, higher taxes, more roadblocks. President Biden has also appointed a long list of far-left anti-energy nominees that want to destroy oil and gas, close off capital markets, and stoke climate fear. John Kerry, the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, is more focused on the emissions of the war in Ukraine than the war himself, saying, obviously, I'm quoting Mr. Kerry, obviously you're going to have massive emissions as a consequence of the war. But equally importantly, he said, you're going to lose people's focus, and said later that the Ukraine refugees, this is what he said in the last couple of days, will be nothing like the climate refugees we will see. Secretary Holland, Secretary of Interior, has said, and I quote her, I am wholeheartedly against fracking and drilling on public lands. Gina McCarthy, former EPA minister under Barack Obama, now the White House National Climate Advisor, said, and I quote, this is a day of reckoning for the oil and gas sector. Sarah Bloom Raskin, the nominee for the Federal Reserve, urged the Federal Reserve to stop investing in traditional energy. This was not a term paper from college. This was a New York Times op-ed she wrote in March of 2020, saying, and I quote her, fossil fuels are a terrible investment, and the Fed should not, quote, prop up and enrich oil and gas. Ms. Omarova, the former nominee for Comptroller of Currency, said she wanted small oil and gas players to go bankrupt. All these actions and statements have real-world market consequences. They chill the capital markets. They chill the risk and reward equation as we're looking to expand and explore new areas for American energy. Fertilizer prices are out of control. You talk to your farmers and ranchers, as I do back home in Montana, they've more than doubled. Some can't even get it, and some are wondering, can I get the fertilizer in the ground this spring so I can even plant? Investments are trending down. Domestic oil production was lower in 21 than it was in 2019. Since President Biden's first day in office, oil prices have steadily gone up, up, and up. And when oil prices skyrocketed, gasoline prices spiked. Instead of calling on the United States, if I was President Biden, watch what's going on with $5 a gallon plus gasoline, rather than reach out to Venezuela, rather than reach out to Iran, why wouldn't the first instinct of this president be, let's call the oil and gas producers across America to the White House for an emergency summit and talk about how do we get another 3 to 5 billion barrels a day here in America or in Canada? I mean, from trusted allies. When his instincts were to reach out to adversaries, that tells you a lot about how captivated he is and held hostage to the climate change ideology, which is wreaking havoc right now in the global energy markets. Why on earth would the United States want to increase imports from unstable and adversarial countries? We could increase production here, work with Canada, as well as U.S. producers to increase our energy trade. We can and should be energy dominant. And by the way, this challenge is not going away in the next 3 to 6 months. We've got to get back on track of a Made in America energy strategy, because peak oil, we're still 15, 20, 30 years away from peak oil in the world, not to mention in our country as well. We can do it. We should do it. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask one question here for Ms. Hertias, and that is, what action can the administration and Congress take today to spur investment and production of all the above energy portfolio that includes oil, gas, coal, nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, and more?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Daines. I think that I fully agree. This is a moment in time where we can and we must do both. We need to look at the energy system as a whole. We need to invest heavily and continue against our objectives in the energy transition and make sure that we're looking at how we move forward really in a fundamental way to get CCUS projects up and running, how we make sure that we are bringing more molecules as well as electrons into the total system. And much of that has to do with actions that can be taken on permitting and on leasing, as well as looking at infrastructure to make sure that we have the ultimate degree of flexibility that we will need and do need right now to continue to look after the totality of the energy system as a whole.
Thank you so much, and we'll have a second round if you need it. Okay, Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've been, I think, talking around the primary problem here, which is a lack of supply. I may be the only person at this dais who remembers the Arab oil embargo of early 1970s, and the price went up because the supply went down. You weren't. You were a little kid, Barrasso, don't get me. The price went up because the supply went down. The price went down because we had more supply than demand during the pandemic, and production went down because of the collapse in demand. The demand came back, but the supply didn't come back. Why didn't the supply come back? Because the oil industry made a conscious decision to invest in their shareholders rather than their production capability. This past year, they've announced almost $40 billion of stock buybacks, which does nothing for production or anybody else except shareholders and perhaps the executives, and about $50 billion of dividends. That's money that could have gone into investment for production. And that's the reality. That's what's driving this. It isn't lease pauses on federal land, and it isn't the Keystone Pipeline. My mother used to say, you're straining at gnats and swallowing camels. The lease pause is a gnat. The Keystone Pipeline, which was mostly for export, is a gnat. The camel is the failure of the industry to respond to the increase in demand since the decline of the pandemic. An executive in the industry put it, I think, absolutely perfectly when he said just a few weeks ago, you've made a promise to be more disciplined, a promise to his shareholders, getting cash back to shareholders with these dividends. The question is, are you going to keep your promise, or are you going to be patriotic? Well, we all know what they chose, not to be patriotic. And the production isn't there. And I understand some reluctance because of the hammering that they took during the pandemic. But that's really the fundamental problem here. And what's hampering the growth of production isn't federal policy, and it isn't scary statements from the White House about climate change. It's a failure to invest in the production capability. And that's really what's driving this. Mr. Eklund, you made this point that it was the COVID recovery that has driven the increase in demand. Supply hasn't kept pace, and therefore prices are up. And now the war in Ukraine has further strained supply, or at least has affected the international market. Again, prices have gone up almost 50 cents or $1 just since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. This is all about supply and demand. And in response, I just parenthetically want to say the estimate by the World Bank for climate migrants by 2050 is 200 million people. That is a national security disaster. So if anybody questions what I'm saying, just Google oil buybacks, and you'll read about the stock buybacks and the dividends that are being paid rather than investment in production. Mr. Eklund, am I on the right track here?
Senator, the interaction between investors and the oil and gas industry is a pretty nuanced one, and I would stress that it's not a really elective kind of an interaction. The oil and gas companies cannot thumb their nose at the concern of investors, or investors will walk away from them. So I think that.
But there's a difference between, they make the highest profits in 8 years last year. So it's not a question of thumbing your nose, it's a question of proportionality. And there certainly could have been greater investment in increased production rather than, I mean, that's really what we're talking about here.
Well, and I think that my expectation is that you will see a change in the production levels that in part reflects the really acute sense that this time is different. So, you know, these discussions that are taking place this week, for example, at a major conference in Houston, I think you're going to see a response. The last point that I would make is that for big companies like one represented at this witness table, revenues off their hydrocarbon activities also support in a critical way what they are trying to do in the decarbonized space.
I don't question that. I think that's a great output. My problem is the diversion of the record profits, or the highest profits in 8 years, to non-production or non-fossil fuel alternatives. One other just minor point, not a minor point, but a separate point. Everybody's talking about LNG. We're talking about LNG as we're exporting, we're helping our Europeans. I just want to note, increased LNG exports beyond some certain point, which is we're about 15% of production now, is going to indubitably affect domestic prices. Again, supply and demand. If we diminish the supply available in the United States by exporting 15, 20, 30%, which is in the pipeline, which is in the construction pipeline, domestic prices for natural gas are going to surge. That happened in Australia. It's going to happen here. And it just seems to me we need to be clear-eyed about this and understand it. It bothers me that everybody's on the LNG bandwagon without taking cognizance of the effect on domestic gas prices, which affects manufacturers and, Lord knows, consumers all over the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Senator Murkowski.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I'm going to go back to a phrase that you used in your opening statement. You said we need to be operating in reality. And I think part of the challenge that we have faced is everybody's got really quick, easy answers. Just produce more. You have leases. Just dial it up. Like there is some easy button that we can increase production in this country, or that really any other producing country can. And I want to focus in a little bit on how we operate in reality. And you use the term, Dr. Foss, we need to face reality. So you indicated that industry knows how to deal with risk. They deal with that every day. But it's the uncertainty with policy that really puts handcuffs on the ability to move forward. So I want I want to understand what it is that could be done, could be said, could be messaged from this administration, whether it's President Biden or the Secretary of Interior. What is the message that reduces some of the uncertainty? Because when you have uncertainty, investors don't invest. The producers are not going to, they're not going to look at these leases that perhaps are a little more speculative. They're not going to be moving out as quickly as they might want. We're all agreeing that we need to get production up. Everybody has said we need to get production up. But you can't, there's no easy button here, and they need some level of certainty with the message that comes, because you said perception is reality. If President Biden came out today and said, we as an energy producing nation need to ramp up our production. Yes, we need to ensure that we're focused on lower carbon intensity, because he ran on that. But I don't think that this is a mutually exclusive proposition here. What is the signal? What is the message that could be sent that's going to help my state as a producing state, those in the Gulf of Mexico? What do you need to hear? Ms. Hurstis?
Yes, thank you, Senator Murkowski. I think a very strong message would be to quickly progress and within the next few months have a proposal around a 5-year plan. At this point, we don't have line of sight. We've gone a period of time where we have not acquired new leases, and I think both for the funnel in the pipeline, this conveyor belt of activity, but also the very strong messages to companies like Shell and others that there is certainty that we will be able to obtain leases and continue to progress with our activities would go a long way.
So 5-year plan, Dr. Foss?
I'm going to try to answer your question by giving some support to my colleague to my right. Jonathan is trying to get people to understand, I think, the role of the investor community in all of this. For Shell to be able to continue to build a portfolio of leases to at least hold production flat, their large institutional investors need to have confidence that they're not a sunsetted industry.
Right.
And out there, that is the opinion. And that's why companies are under pressure to buy back shares and return money to investors. And this is a hard thing to talk about and deal with. I mean, this is not easy. We can't capture it in a data point, but we have memos, we have letters from CEOs, opinions of large fund managers, testimonies, op-eds, other things that are going on, and all of that creates an environment. I want to correct something that I said, because earlier I said, for over a year this has been going on. This has actually been going on for several years. There's been growing pressure to try to use the financial markets to try to discipline energy policy or influence energy policy in ways that are making responses difficult now.
Well, they're told, the financiers on the East Coast are telling Alaskans, anything in the Arctic we're not going to finance, period.
And Senator, as you well know, it's to be able to get the rigs there, to be able to get the services there, the service community has to have the same level of confidence. Stepping out of the White House and saying, we have confidence in the oil and gas industry, we want the financial markets to support them, sending that message could actually be an interesting thing.
It's kind of a dream, but you know what? We've been told these are extraordinary times that deserve extraordinary measures. In the meantime, you have war in Ukraine, you have hospitals that are being indiscriminately blown up, children dying, and we're trying to decide whether or not we should participate in this war over energy. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Rono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really interesting discussion. I do agree with Senator King's description of what's causing gas prices to go up. When the supply goes down, the prices go up. And he referred to the oil embargo of 1970. I would, more recently in 2008, for example, the average national price of regular gas reached roughly $5.37 when adjusted for inflation, which is above the current national average of $4.22. Back in 2008, Biden was not the president, so all these efforts to blame President Biden it doesn't make sense, very totally misplaced. And in fact, if anybody is to blame for the current situation, it should be Putin. So in the 2008 oil price shocks solidified Hawaii's commitment to move toward renewable power because we were the most oil import dependent state in the entire country. So our effort to become energy self-sufficient is now at 30% with the goal of 100% self-sufficiency to renewables and alternatives by 2045. So Hawaii got it. I'm wondering when the rest of the country is going to get it, that we need to become energy self-sufficient. At the same time, it's very clear that we're using, or our approach is all of the above, which is to also rely on fossil fuels, but at the same time to acknowledge, as Ms. Hrstia said, climate change is real. We can't keep pumping carbon into the air. We have a responsibility, I would say, to get a better handle on that. So, Mr. Elkine, do you think that at a time like this, we should be accelerating the development, for example, of electric vehicles and other zero-emission transportation options so that we will eventually not have to worry about gas prices or give Putin and other oligarchs the ability to use oil as a weapon?
Senator, thank you for the question. As I said in my remarks, I do think it is incredibly important that we realize both the emergency situation in which we find ourselves with war going on in Ukraine, and that we are setting the stage for another problem that we will have seen coming, but we will not have responded to. So yes, continued investment in decarbonized energy systems is vital. And in fact, I think it is worth bearing in mind that underinvestment, which has rightly been focused on in this conversation today as a real issue for the oil and gas industry, is not limited to the oil and gas industry. We are underinvesting in all of our energy systems, and we do so at our own peril.
So for example, I note that in March 6th, Germany's finance minister stated that Germany is now planning to spend 200 billion euros, or about $220 billion, to fund industrial transformation between now and 2026, including climate protection, hydrogen technology, and expansion of the electric vehicle charging network. I don't consider going to electric vehicles as some sort of a pipe dream. I think it is a necessary step. So do you think, and again, this is for Mr. Elkine, the United States should take a similar step by passing the over $550 billion in clean energy incentives that the House has passed and the Senate committees have put forward?
Senator, speaking personally, yes, I strongly support that. I would note that the move to electric vehicles is not uncomplicated. Melanie Kenderdine very strongly highlighted one feature of this. But this is where the industry is going. Our own companies want to go there. We should be foursquare behind it.
This is for Ms. Hrstia, I'm sorry. So Senator Cortez Masto and Senator King both addressed the earnings of the oil companies, but don't you have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders to maximize your profits?
No. Our shareholders want to be able to invest in us for the short, medium, and long term. It isn't just a short-term gain that they're looking for. And so while it's very important that we foster and look after the shareholders and make sure that we're looking after the short term, they really are very interested in the medium and long term, and that includes our oil and gas production, and we continue to invest heavily multi-billion dollars on an annual basis in our oil and gas business to make sure that we are continuing to supply the needed energy to the world today. And we do take the profits that we make in the upstream, as Mr. Elkin has described, and those are invested back into businesses that do not make money today. It's invested back in research, it's invested back in CCUS, it's invested back in offshore wind leases in New York that we recently bid on for almost $400 million, and that's just for the lease. And to compare that to the amount that we exposed in the last lease sale, which was $20 million in the Gulf of Mexico. So you see a significant difference there in the amount that we're investing in renewables to make sure that we're looking after the longer term as well as the short term in the total revenue and profitability of the company.
Well, Mr. Chairman, perhaps that story needs to be better told, because Shell reported earnings of $19.29 billion for 2021, laid out plans to raise dividends and spend $8.5 billion to buy back shares. Exxon, BP, and Chevron laid out similar share buyback programs, and the four companies, including Shell, reported $75 billion in profits for 2021. It is no wonder that the oil industry is being looked at as really engaging in not exactly what we call long-term approach to this current crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would note that President Biden's EIA numbers for the next 30 years show that oil and gas usage worldwide will continue to increase past 2050. That even President Biden's numbers from his administration, as they look at oil and gas usage and the importance of oil and gas for the next 30 years, list globally we're going to continue to need more oil and gas. So I'm grateful that companies are still exploring, that are still taking the risk, that are still trying to be able to find capital when people are being squeezed out from capital, because quietly the administration is saying we need more because the world needs more, but publicly they're saying we need less, we need less, we need less. So at some point we've got to address that doublespeak in the middle of this. Dr. Foss, you made an interesting statement at the beginning of this. You ended your opening testimony with, we have to remember we need to put materials first. Can you expand on that some?
Well, I want to, again, support another witness here. Jonathan's point about the amount of effort that it's going to take to do something like put electric vehicles on the road. This all of the above portfolio or idea that people walk around with is very uneven. There are pieces of that are going to take a very long time to do. There are some things that might take a little bit less time, but generally speaking, we're talking about really, really large changes. We need supporting infrastructure. To put an electric vehicle together, you have to have the raw materials coming into the manufacturing processes to be able to do that. You have to be able to source them. As I said, they have to be the right quality. When you make batteries, purity is a really big deal. You have to be able to deliver them cost effectively. Before the run-up in nickel prices this week, automakers were already worried about the cost of nickel. $30,000 a ton and everything looks different when you're trying to manufacture EVs. Same thing with copper, with aluminum, with manganese, with cobalt, you name it. There are like 30 different minerals and those associated industries and processes that we have to pay attention to. Which really complicates the picture when
it does. And
we're talking about oil and petroleum fuels and refining seems so simple in comparison, and they're complicated enough. So you have to be able to charge EVs. You have to have a power grid to support charging of EVs. If you want to use electric vehicles for demand response, for storage, you have to be able to have the equipment to do that. People have to know how to use the vehicles. There's a whole host of things that has to happen to be able to make it work. But if you can't get the materials, you're never going to get there.
Right.
So materials policy is the first place to start.
And we've already seen China use their ability to be able to limit access to resources to Japan, to Australia. They'll cut off a country if they decide they don't like a country at that point. We are extremely vulnerable. The more dependent we are on any other nation for our energy production, to be able to make sure that our energy is such that if a nation decides they're going to be upset with us, especially a communist country or an authoritarian government like Russia is, that if they decide they're in a bad mood that day and they murder their neighbors or they cut off people in the supply chain just because they can,
Most
that
of the
cuts off
minerals that
America.
we rely on, sir, come from fragile states that we have no ability to deal with, we have no proper responses for, we don't engage with them, they're very difficult to engage with, and trying to influence them in their actions, trying to bring them into the global community is very, very difficult.
Thank you. Mr. Sirtis, I want to ask you about crude coming from the Gulf. If we're replacing Russian crude or Venezuelan or Iranian or whatever it may be, there's a lot of conversation about heavy crude versus light sweet. Light sweet that we're often getting in the United States on land. In the Gulf, we're getting more heavy crude. Can we supply what we need for the blending that's asked for our refineries from what's coming from Canada, Mexico, and our own Gulf if we actually tap into those resources?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Across the U.S., there is a variety of different types of crude that we can process in our refineries. Currently, the setup that we have right now is for the types of supplies that those refineries and those manufacturing facilities have been geared to process. There are changes that can be made within that, but there's an important piece of being able to move product around the country more easily that will help and aid in that total situation. And maybe just to come back to a question that you asked around the need to continue to produce more oil and gas, and specifically with strong demand needs beyond 2050. I think within that, there's an important part to remember that carbon capture sequestration and how we take the carbon that will be emitted from production and use of oil and gas, which there are many needs that exist beyond just combustion in a car, many products that we're going to need for the future. We need to make sure that that is a robust piece of policy that we have, and that we have the tools in place, not from a technical perspective, because technically we know how to do it. This is more from the land usage and overall how the system works, and that it can be incentivized to make sure that consumers are acting in a way that is consistent with reducing our need on oil and gas.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would just make one comment to our committee as a whole. 6 years ago, we as a Congress voted to allow the export of natural gas. This industry that we have, the exporting, is only 6 years old. It's very, very young in the process. But if we were not exporting natural gas, I cannot imagine what Europe would be facing right now and the pressure they'd be facing right now, well above and beyond what they're already facing, with 38% of their natural gas coming from Russia. But if we were not exporting natural gas and we had made that decision 6 years ago, this day would be even worse than it already is. So I'm grateful that we made that decision. We need to make some more long-term decisions that will help our energy future.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Washington constituents I represent have always paid very high gas prices. We've been an isolated market, mostly oil coming from Alaska and then refined in our refineries. So all these issues become very interesting, even when we see various impacts. When we have high costs because we're an isolated market, and then we have high costs because we're still impacted, even though we're an isolated market. So it just seems that we are always, so that is why I'm very ardent about trying to diversify off of that vulnerability. At $4.63 a gallon, my constituents are already, seeing the impacts. And so to me, this is an issue about our challenges in a world market, and this committee has had lots of hearings about price and what impacts price on a global basis. But clearly, OPEC, even though Saudi countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE have significant swing capacity, they seem to always figure out a way to not be as helpful on this issue. The top 6 oil companies made $90 billion in profits last year. So, Mr. Chairman, I believe in getting them in here and getting them to raise their right hand and asking them questions about this issue. We need, which the Energy and Commerce Committee have done before, maybe we should do a joint hearing and do that, because I think that we find out a lot of answers about what's going on. I'll never forget the Exxon chairman being in front of one of our committees, and he basically said, yeah, there's no reason that oil shouldn't be at $60 because that's exactly what it costs to produce it plus some. And so I think, and that was when oil was being manipulated in other markets, and he was very concerned about that. They were concerned at $150 a barrel. They weren't the ones that were making the money, but Wall Street was driving that price up, and it was affecting our economy and ultimately undermined our economy. So I think that these record profits are something to discuss with them as we all try to tighten our belts and try to have an impact on a big sector of the Russian economy. I know that for us, thousands of dollars to fill up rigs when you're in the transportation business, which so many people in our state are, is also a big concern. And that this is about America's long-term national security. President Bush was brave enough to say this in his State of the Union address 15 years ago, but we're still here in this vulnerable position, making some traction, but not enough traction to figure out how to get to be really, truly energy independent. Not as long as OPEC and the cartel can manipulate the world supply, we will definitely have challenges here at home. So to me, that is why I believe that we need to do everything we can to diversify off of this source and move forward. In reality, President Biden administration approved 34% more permits for oil and gas in public lands in the first year of office, more than what was done by the Trump administration. And so to me, I look at it and say, now I have one of the highest install rates of electric vehicles in the country, and instead of filling up at $4 or $4.50, I can fill up for $1 a gallon. So that's what my constituents want to see, the reality of that and the reality of moving forward on higher adoption rates. We need to make our gas-powered cars more efficient. We need to make our boats and trucks and planes look at hydrogen. There's so many of these issues that I believe, Mr. Chairman, we need to move forward on. But I'd like to ask the witnesses a question about, because every time we get into one of these areas, and we've been here several times, lots of ideas are thrown on the table. And for the most part, they have nothing to do with that is going to affect the price at the pump today. So I just want to bring up a few issues. So Occidental Petroleum CEO said this week that because of challenges like aging wells, labor shortages, supply chain crush, U.S. producers cannot ramp up production even in response to skyrocketing oil prices. Do you agree, Mr. Eklund or Ms. Kinderling, about that? Kinderline, do you agree that U.S. productions cannot be meaningfully increased, say by 20% or so, just to help us in the short term?
Me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. I think that there is obviously capacity to increase production, but I've been listening to all of this, and
that would affect the price right now.
If you increase production, yeah.
Would it affect the price right now?
Increasing production would affect the price. I would say that the price of oil is set on global markets. It's not only about U.S. demand, and so.
So my point about OPEC being the big.
I do think that I've spent a lot. I worked at DOE for 8 years in the Clinton administration and 4 years in the Obama administration. Spent a lot of time in OPEC countries. The U.S. oil production and it's basically shale oil has diminished the power of OPEC to set global prices, which I think is a good thing. But I think that we could fairly rapidly ramp up production in response to demand. That's how oil and gas prices get set. It's a supply and demand thing, and but I would say one other thing about high prices. I've been listening to a lot of this. We've had COVID. We have Ukraine. 130 countries have net zero targets, so the financial community is very worried about additional investments in fossil fuels around the world. There are a whole lot of things that are creating uncertainty in energy markets right now. And so I'm not sure that we can make hard and fast conclusions about what's going on in markets because of that.
Okay,
So.
Mr. Eklund, did you have a comment on that? My time has expired, I guess. I guess I talked longer there at the front end.
Go ahead and respond, sir.
Oh, okay. Well, apparently all my colleagues have, so go ahead. Let's get an answer on the record on this. This issue about can we really do something today that would affect the price today, or are we just constantly going to be jawboning with OPEC over these issues?
Senator, I understand Vicki Hollob's comment as being that there's no overnight fix, right? But these are issues that all of the companies, as I understand it, are dealing with and are prepared to, try to respond to. But there are workforce shortages, and there are supply chain issues, and yes, there's a capital issue. So overnight change, no. Directional change, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to be clear, I believe in the directional change of getting my constituents the $1 per gallon instead of the $4 per gallon. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cassidy.
Hey, thank you all. First, I want to say with great pride, I have two of the panelists with strong Louisiana ties. Dr. Michelle Foss, I'm the only one to put in Michaud before and you're a graduate of University of Louisiana. And Ms. Hertuis, graduate of Tulane. And so just thank you both. Don't think it's accidental. Louisiana is kind of an epicenter of oil and gas. I say that, by the way. Republicans have now become known as the working class party. I am very aware that the workers required to develop these rigs have been dispersed because of the downturn in the oil market. And to say just ramp up production when the workers are now doing something else is just kind of, frankly, standing on the shore and telling the waves not to come in. So I want to credit our workers, but also point out the kind of disingenuousness that you can just reassemble that so quickly. Secondly, I think what has been missing in the Biden administration, I think it's a fair statement, if there is a nexus between energy, national security, climate, and the economy of a country and the economy of a family. Just to put in a plug for what we've been doing, we just put out yesterday something which should be online on my website, but that said, which attempts to address that nexus. It's what the five of you have been discussing. And of course, if you have a chance to look at it, we'd love your feedback. And then now, Ms. I won't be the only one to stumble over your last name, Ms.
Herstius.
Ms. Herstius, the crux of this conversation is the regulatory environment of this administration inhibiting the production of U.S. oil and gas resources, and, frankly, the deployment of CCUS capability and other things, the deployment of renewable, et cetera. Is there an inefficient, even hostile regulatory environment? Let me ask you, in the Gulf of Mexico, do you have currently permits that are you awaiting on permits that are preventing you from drilling new wells?
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. And there are actually 3 people on the panel who have very close Louisiana ties. So
who's the third?
Married to a Louisianian.
Clearly, he's a social climber.
Yes. Let me just reinforce a couple of things that you said. One, you mentioned our workforce, and you gave credit to our workforce. And I couldn't be more proud of the people who continue to support our industry, and the Shell employees, as well as many other industry employees who have really gone above and beyond through COVID to make sure that we continue producing and operated. So huge credit to them. Second is that on your question about are there things that are inhibiting us to produce more?
No. Do you have permits right now before the federal government upon which you are waiting, and until you receive them, you cannot begin to drill?
So we do have seismic permits that once.
How many of those do you have pending?
We currently have 4 seismic permits that we're waiting to get approved.
And how long have you been waiting on them so far?
I don't know exactly the amount of time.
Ballpark,
we've been waiting.
a week,
Longer,
a month, a
longer
year?
Longer than the normal amount of time.
And what is the normal amount of time?
It depends on the size of the survey, but some of this has to do with the
No,
environment.
but for these particular permits, help me out, I'm running out of time. How long, when would you expect this to be done, and how long have you been waiting?
I think that there can be a way forward through this that is.
I don't know why you won't tell me, and I don't mean to be mean. How long have you been waiting on these permits?
I don't know the exact
Got
amount
it.
of time.
And how long would you typically wait on these permits?
Sometimes seismic permits can take, depending on the size of it, they take different amounts of time, and that has to do with the
I
environment.
get that, but what is the,
It can take months, or it can take 1 month to 6 to 8 months.
If you had those permits approved today, how long would it be until you're actually producing oil and gas?
We have rigs that are on contract, and on a very short period of time, we can begin to drill those wells.
Could you have oil and gas being hitting the shores of Louisiana for our refineries within 12 months if you had the permits today?
We could.
You could. And do you anticipate getting these permits tomorrow?
We don't have line of sight to that. We think
you don't have line of sight, which is a euphemistic way of saying no.
We may get one.
You may get 1 out of the 4.
Correct.
But if you got all 4, you could even increase it even more. What is the holdup on getting the rest of those approved?
The holdup has to do with the environmental assessment and the marine mammal life in the area.
And what marine mammal in particular?
This has to do with whales in the Gulf of Mexico.
There are not that many whales in the Gulf of Mexico. Is that really what's holding it up? Because I'm from Louisiana. There's not that many whales in the Gulf of Mexico.
That's my understanding.
And so we're not getting seismic. If you had it, we could have gas being produced in 12 months, but you're not getting it, and you don't know when you're going to get it. Now, I just want to say for the record, when Secretary Granholm says that permits are not a factor here, I think we have an example of where, and by the way, you're being incredibly diplomatic. I suspect you fear retribution, but still, nonetheless, we have a clear example of that. Let me just quickly say one more thing. Oh, I have one from Mr. Metlock. Where did I go? Mr. Medlock, there's been a lot of conversation about the profits of the super majors as regards somehow they're being nefarious by not doing more oil and gas, and that's why we have a problem. But it's my understanding that about 90% of the oil that is produced is actually produced by independents, not the super majors, but the Apaches of the world. I've also understood in 2020 about 100 of them went bankrupt. So we've been talking about the role of the investor community, the ESG community, that's putting pressure upon the independents with their need for capital. Seeing how they apparently control 90% of the production in the U.S., can you comment, as others have, upon the role of the investor community in inhibiting the development of new oil and gas leases by the group of folks that do 90% of it, which would be the independents?
Well, it's not a simple answer, but the investment community is probably the most powerful arm in determining what future production looks like. Everybody's referred to the pipeline of permits and whatnot that need to be in place so that you can actually develop oil and gas resources and deliver them to the market. And that's actually something that needs to be, I think, brought farther up to the surface here, because it's been alluded to, but you go back to 2020, all these companies lost a lot of money. In 2021, they're dealing, yes, they made tremendous profits, but they're also dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty with regard to what's the future direction of oil, what are the pending legal cases against them. We know actually of the Dutch court's ruling about Shell and its decarbonization efforts. You look at how that all manifests through concerns about new variants of the pandemic, with IEA actually talking about demand reductions perhaps as these new variants actually emerged. You're talking about operating through an environment that has tremendous uncertainty, and it's very difficult to convince investors to pull the trigger on massive new production options when they don't know whether or not the returns will be there. So that all is incredibly important. It's not as simple as just taking a snapshot view of the oil and gas market, thinking about production. And the last thing I'll say, what you actually have seen over the last year and a half or so is an increase in production in the U.S. alone of over 1 million barrels a day. So it hasn't been static. It's actually grown. A lot of that growth has been focused on deploying the DUCs, or the drilled but uncompleted well inventory. And so that's a lot of that's, quite frankly, because the capital's not there to go out and drill the new wells, and there's reluctance to do so because you don't know actually what the near term brings. And so we're in a really strange environment, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine just sort of was the final match that lit the fire to push us well over $100 a barrel.
Gotcha. I yield back, and thank you for your indulgence.
I thank my colleague. Before Senator Murkowski leaves, this reminds me of the days when I was chair and you were ranker, and we were always doing things together and calling a lot of audibles, and that's what's going to happen now. So I'm going to recognize myself, and then we'll go to Senator Hyde-Smith, and we'll go to Senator Hickenlooper, and then we'll go to Senator Hoeven, and that will complete the first round. But I gather some of our colleagues would like a second round, and we're just going to keep this thing going, okay? All right, colleagues, thank you. I'm going to touch briefly on two topics. This week, I introduced a bill that will modernize existing domestic mineral production. And the bill focuses on increasing the domestic supply of critical minerals, reducing our reliance on foreign energy, and supporting domestic manufacturing, which I think we all understand is critical to building the next generation of clean energy products and fueling the kind of red, white, and blue clean energy that we want with good American jobs on American soil. And the heart of my legislation is to turn existing leases into energy-producing sites. If we're going to wean ourselves off foreign oil and gas imports and transition to clean energy, this is a national security issue. It's an environmental issue. I look forward to talking with my colleagues about it in the days ahead, and the legislation was just introduced this week. The other matter I want to touch on is our Clean Energy for America Act, which passed the Senate Finance Committee, which I chair, some months ago. And there's been a development this week. I just want to briefly describe the bill and talk about the development this week. This legislation was years and years in the making, something that Chairman Manchin and I talked about when he invited me to West Virginia. And what we essentially did is take the 40-some energy provisions in the federal tax code, and we threw them in the garbage can. We said, this is basically about yesteryear. We need something that rewards innovation, and Senator Manchin and I agreed that one of the keys to the bill was to be technologically neutral. And the reason that made sense is because nobody even knows decades from now which will be the best carbon emission reducers. So let's give everybody a chance to hit that kind of target, reducing carbon emissions. So the bill is tech neutral, it's market oriented, and what it does is it takes that technological neutrality and says the more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings. All right? House has advanced it. We're going to advance it here. Really like to work with all my colleagues on this. And this week, there's a report with fresh evidence on the importance of this legislation. The Rhodium Group, a well-thought-of group of energy analysts, said that these proposals would reduce how much money the United States spends on oil by nearly a quarter and increase our capacity to export oil by nearly 30% and natural gas by 15%. So this is an economic winner. It is a environmental winner. It's a winner for our kids and our grandkids. So without objection, I'm going to put that into the record at this time. And the order for the completion of the first round will now be our colleague from Mississippi, Senator Hyde-Smith, and Senator Hickenlooper would be the next to follow. Hope he can return, and then Senator Hoeven. Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses today. You've done a tremendous job, and this is long and enduring, but I certainly appreciate your willingness to come and testify before the U.S. Senate. That says a lot about you. Long before Putin ever invaded Ukraine last fall, and this is for you, Mr. Medlock, President Biden finally began recognizing the high gasoline prices paid by families and businesses last fall. But instead of increasing production here at home, the president blamed U.S. energy companies OPEC and Russia for weeks before releasing 50 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or about 2.5 days worth of U.S. consumption. Last Tuesday, the president again, instead of increasing U.S. production, announced another release of 30 million barrels. Mr. Medlock, briefly, what is the short and the long-term impact we can expect from pulling from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
Well, use of the SPR is actually warranted, I would argue, in this case. So it's a stopgap measure, right? It's really meant to bridge the very near-term needs of the marketplace to sort of help quell price heights and volatility. But longer term, there does need to be an increase in production because, absent that, you can deplete the SPR very quickly, and then where are you? So it's really a short-term mechanism. It's classic inventory withdrawal sort of discussion.
So do you believe it's wise in the best interest of our national security to repeatedly return to the emergency stockpile just to lower gas prices for just a few days?
Well, the impact in terms of a few days, it's really wise to use it to help bridge the gap until you can actually get new production online, right? Because at the end of the day, if you're going to use inventory as an inventory, it has to be replenished as well. And I think Melanie actually referred to backwardation on the curve as an argument for actually pulling more crude into the present, which means withdraw from inventory and then refill later. So it is a wise move, absolutely.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Herstesis, I find it difficult to believe we would not be facing an energy crisis if we had maintained greater independence, including exporting significant amounts of LNG. After President Biden's ban on new oil and gas lease sales on federal lands and offshore, the administration continually gaslit Americans by saying there are 9,000 approved drilling permits not being used. However, we know it's one thing to have a lease, it's another for it to actually have the green light to produce on the lease after jumping through the ever-increasing regulatory hoops. All this to say we are nowhere close to realizing our nation's full potential as a global energy producer. And how would that maximize oil and gas production help stabilize these markets right now?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question. I think the environment that we are in, and I'll speak about the Gulf of Mexico with regard to permits, we get permits on a regular basis. Every activity that we have has oversight by the regulator and requires a permit. And currently we're in an environment where the majority of those permits are issued regularly and do not disrupt our business. There are a few areas where, like I mentioned before, like in seismic permitting, where we do see a disruption. And on the leasing, leasing is very important to keep this conveyor belt of activities going and make sure that we have the feedstock of opportunities that we can evaluate to determine where we need to explore and where our barrels of tomorrow will come from. So it's very important that we keep that conveyor belt going. As far as additional supply that we can bring online and how to do that more quickly, I think there is an important step that needs to be taken to look at how we can accelerate the permitting and approval process, because that will result in faster activity and more oil and gas coming online. And that's really across all aspects of our industry, oil and gas, as well as renewables, because really everything has a permitting component to it. So I think that's a consistent thread that can be improved. And really those are solvable problems. There's not technical aspects that stand in the way of improving on that aspect of the system.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Foss?
Before the President announced a U.S. ban on Russian oil, the United States was importing about 700,000 barrels per day of Russian crude and petroleum products. Europe, which is a much heavier reliance, imports about 4 million barrels per day. With this ban in place, what vacuum are we going to see in the oil and gas market, and how best can the United States contribute to stabilizing and returning domestic and global prices back to a more economically sustainable level?
In fact, our Russian import history is even more interesting than that. We've been talking about it internally. I was looking at it the other day. We imported for a few years, 2010 to about 2014. Then we were flush with our own production, and nothing arrived. Then we started taking a bit more to close gaps because of what everyone has pointed out. We had a surge that caught a lot of people off guard in economic activity as people started coming out of the COVID closets. And of course, you know, we have the issue with Ukraine now affecting that. So what companies are doing to make up that gap is, fortunately, it's a small one. They're striving to source oil from different places. A lot of that is going to come from domestic production because there are ways of doing that. As Ken pointed out, we have managed to grow domestic production. Other suppliers around the world, other inventories that are available around the world. We haven't talked about the trader component of this. They also own physical inventory, and they're actively in the market looking at how to move some of those short-term cargoes into some of the refiners' locations for use. The two places that happen to be most impacted are the East and the West Coast, because most Russian oil was going to the Eastern refineries and the West Coast refineries to close gaps there. That's where most of those barrels were going. And those locations are not well served by pipelines that can deliver our own domestic supply. So that puts the pipeline conduit picture back on the table. What can we do to help debottleneck? How can we better serve our own communities? Over what time period could we get that done? We have efforts underway that people have been holding or working on for a while to try to expand capacity out of the Permian, out of Texas, out of the Gulf Coast. We've had a lot of changes in how oil flows around the country with our own domestic production growth. And then we have one more thing that I'm going to put on the table, and I know that it's really controversial. We could sell more of our own oil to our own markets if we could ship it in our own waters. So I know that talking about the Jones Act is not anything that anyone ever wants to do, but we have to acknowledge it's there. And at a time like this, you know, we have to put everything on the table. And I want to say that in light of the conversation today, and especially since we're going to have a second round, what if it gets worse? None of us have talked about that. I'm sure you all are thinking about it. I have all kinds of personal scenarios of what could happen with this event or what could dovetail with it. We may be in an extended, protracted period that we need to be thinking about for quite a while. We have to deliver to our defense forces. We have to be able to be sure that we can run the global fleets of cars, trucks, trains, railroads, everything else. So thinking about how we move our own production to ourselves is something that we could be doing along with other things.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. So I think you covered it, but Dr. Foss, we need to produce more oil and gas in this country. Things we can do right now that would move the needle are?
Well, again, we've put a lot of things on the table with regard to leasing, helping all of you and everyone here in town and in state houses around the country and governor's offices understand all the things that the industry has to do to be able to get wells drilled, get them on production, get them hooked up, logistically so that production can get delivered, understanding what it takes. Let me talk about the private producer side for a minute, the small producer side, smaller than, say, the publicly traded independents like Apache and Pioneer and so on, because there is a large fleet still of independent producers active in the United States. We probably still have, 7,000, it gets smaller every day, of small producers who have to go out and contract for services, lease land. Most of the time they're in the private minerals market, but they have to be served. They have to be able to borrow money. They have to be able to finance their activities as well. Don't forget about them. They could actually move pretty quickly, except that one of the issues is getting the service industry to be able to supply locations that are not well served because the service industry contracted in 2020 in such a harsh way. So we do have that we have to think about. But the independent producers, many of them are drilling and pursuing projects that will make a difference at the margin. If they could get a vote of confidence as well, again, stepping out of the White House, giving a vote of confidence to the industry, to the service industry, the service suppliers, the financial community would go a long way.
So if the Biden administration would remove a lot of these restrictions and so forth, that would help galvanize our industry right away, have both an immediate impact as well as a medium and longer term impact in terms of more energy production, specifically as regards both oil and natural gas.
Yes, and I think it can be done responsibly. I agree with Carla on that.
You would agree we have the best environmental standards in the world, wouldn't you,
yes,
in terms of our energy production?
I think we could, and I think that we are responsible anyway.
Right.
So the industry is a very responsible industry.
Right. And thank you. Dr. Medlock, wouldn't you agree that that is also not only vitally important for getting at inflation here at home, but very important in terms of working with our allies as well, specifically relative to what's going on in Ukraine?
Yes, 100% agree with that. Working with our allies, look, I mentioned in my opening remarks that, for the last 10 years, except for the last 2, of course, because of COVID, we'd hosted 23 different delegations from countries all over the world. These are ministerial level delegations, and the one thing they all had in common, because the things were different, but they wanted to talk about U.S. oil and gas. And it had a lot to do with their own energy security motivations and what moving product from this country out into the open water actually meant for the diversity of supply that's available in the global scene, because they all view that as critically important to their own energy security. Even if barrels or molecules of gas are not landing in their country, it actually increases liquidity in the entire global atmosphere, and that bears energy security benefits like nothing else. So anything we can do to, particularly in this current environment, to continue to increase production in a responsible way is going to pay dividends.
Thank you. Ms. Hirstius, did I say your name reasonably close to right?
Pretty close.
Okay. How do you say it?
Hirstius.
Hirstius. Thank you. I'm sorry. We've seen states that have historically been large energy producers of oil and gas, for example, California, that have throttled way back. Doesn't it make sense for us to be producing the energy here at home, even in states like California? Again, we have the best environmental standards versus going to Maduro in Venezuela or going to Iran or going to OPEC or anywhere else.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. I think it is a moment in time when we need to look at all options domestically, and I agree with you that I think we do have the highest environmental standards and need to feel comfort in that, and to know that a barrel that comes from the Gulf of Mexico has amongst the lowest greenhouse gas intensity of a barrel in the world, and that's something that's really important to us. If specific with regard to California, I think that there are things that we need to look at across all of the states to determine what actions can be taken to increase supply. And California does have a significant amount of natural resources, oil and gas, that we can be able to bring onto the market if the conditions are right.
Thank you. And then finally, Ms. Kenderdine, isn't it true that we, in fact, have the best environmental standards? So, for example, if we send LNG to our European allies, I believe on a life cycle basis, they have 41% less greenhouse gas emissions than getting natural gas from Russia. So again, isn't the argument not only that we can produce more energy, but we will actually have better environmental stewardship rather than relying on other parts of the country who are antagonistic to us.
Senator, we do have excellent environmental standards, and I think that that's a given. The Russian system, the gas pipelines leak methane like crazy. It is a highly problematic, and so I think that our exports relative to Russian exports are much more environmentally responsible and sensitive than you would get from Russia. I would also say that in many parts of the world, and we are sending our LNG to Korea, Japan, our biggest customers. A lot of it, and India is now a fairly significant importer of U.S. LNG. It depends on what it's replacing as well. Okay, so India has a lot of coal generation. And they now allow the use of imported LNG for natural gas generation for power generation. So if you were replacing that coal generation with gas generation, you're getting lower emissions as well. And so we do have much better environmental regulations, and it's important, much better than Russia for sure.
Right. Thanks to all the members of the panel. I appreciate your responses. At this point, I better check. Is there anyone else that wanted questions on a second round? Okay. Then if not, thanks again to our witnesses for joining us this morning. Members will have until the close of business tomorrow to submit additional questions for the record. And with that, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.